well. Okay, let me lead into this morning. This is part 3 in our set of sermons to the book of Jonah by this question. Have you ever had a shocking surprise in your life? And if you've been living for any more than about 3 seconds, you've had a few of those. A few years ago, I had one of those shocking experiences that changed my life forever. It was a normal Tuesday, about 2 p.m. in the afternoon, and we just finished a meeting, and in that meeting there was way too much coffee, and at the end of that meeting, I need to go to the bathroom. And so I go to the bathroom and finish, wash my hands, and I open the door, and when I open the door, it's a great day. The universe is at peace. It's amazing. But I did not know what was around the corner, and there's a picture of this, I think, on the screen. I did not know that was around the corner. Had no idea. I'm just coming out of the bathroom, back to the office to finish an amazing Tuesday, and around the corner is that. And the next thing I know, I am being attacked by what looked like a grizzly bear in a blue shirt. And I think you're about to see that picture. There it is, right there. Attacked by a grizzly bear in a blue shirt. And I'm just not a guy who would name names in a moment like this. Daniel Botterf. But there is a day coming. Some people refer to it as payback. There is a day coming for Daniel Botterf in the future. But it was one of those shocking surprises. And if you want a picture of the book of Jonah, that's the picture of the book of Jonah right there. You don't know what's around the corner in the book of Jonah. These surprises in the book of Jonah, they start early and they come often. One after another, just sort of cascading through the story. They start in verse 2. Here's surprise 1 in the book of Jonah. Arise, God says, go to Nineveh, that great city, and call out against it, for their evil has come up before me. Here's surprise number 1 is God's command. 2 verses in, we get a shocking surprise. There are 3 imperatives in verse 2. Imperative number 1 is arise. That brings urgency to the moment. It's not tomorrow, Jonah. No, I want you to get up today, and I want you to go. Arise. Here's command 2. Go to Nineveh. Now, there is a lot of disadvantages to reading the scriptures 2,800 years after the moment that it happened. Right? There's just some things that we miss. And one of the things we are likely to miss in verse 2 is the instant drama that's introduced in that verse, in that text. When you think of Nineveh, I seriously doubt when you hear that word that anger and hatred begin to swirl in your heart. I doubt that happens. But if you were Jonah, or you were one of the people of Israel, the Hebrew people, if you were one of God's people at that time, this would have instantly begun to build in you. The Assyrians were known for their cruelty, for their brutality. They would be considered today a sort of a terrorist state. That's how we would think about the people of Assyria. They would be like if you want an image to maybe help with that, they would be like the big bully on the playground. Right? That every day at recess, they are beating you up, or they are at least threatening to beat you up. That's Assyria. That's the capital of which is Nineveh. But this is the people of Assyria. They were the primary threat to the existence of the people of Israel. If Israel had one big threat at the time, it would be the people of Assyria. And if you know kind of the history of Israel, a few decades later, few years later, the people of Assyria come in and destroy, totally take over the northern kingdom of Israel. So when you hear the word Nineveh, we don't hear it like they hear it. They hear it as, God, you are telling me to go to the big bully on the playground. Now, that is showing us something about the heart of God. That there is this impulse in the heart of God to go to enemies and make them friends. To go to sinners and to make those sinners into saints. There's this impulse in the heart of God that just loves to do that. Now, if you're in Christ, if you're a son or daughter of God, if you're a friend of God in the room, that is your story, isn't it? God has come to you an enemy, according to Romans 5. and he has made you an enemy his friend. In verse 2 of Jonah, and by extension to us, God has invited Jonah to reflect his enemy pursuing heart. He's invited Jonah to reflect that enemy pursuing heart of his, you to reflect that enemy pursuing heart, to go with grace to an enemy. We learn something about the heart of God in that command. Arise. Second command in verse 2, go to Nineveh. And then it says, call out against it. That's the third command, the shocking command of verse 2. Call out against it. God looks at Jonah and says, I want you to say to the people of Nineveh what I say to you. And in chapter 3, we get the sermon. And the sermon is 8 words long. God says, here's what I want you to tell them. Yet 40 days and Nineveh will be overthrown. Now, I'm still trying to learn how to preach less than 40 minutes. An 8-word sermon just feels out of reach for me right now. It just totally feels out of reach. But this is the word that God had for Jonah to tell the people of Nineveh. It's a simple sermon. 40 days and you're dead. But around and inside of these harsh words, there is this beautiful invitation from God. It doesn't have to be that way, Nineveh. You can turn from your sin and you can turn to me and I'll relent of the disaster that I'm saying I'm about to do. There's this beautiful invitation to repent. So here's the first surprise. It's the command of God. Jonah, go to an enemy nation and I want you to go with grace to these enemies, Jonah. That's the first surprise. But verse 3 brings the next shocking turn in the book of Jonah. Surprise 2 is Jonah's response to God. Now, if you can just remember back to the first time you read the story of Jonah, and just ask yourself the question, when you're reading the story, what are you expecting to see and to witness and to read as you're reading through this story? You're anticipating that the story is going to go like this. God tells Jonah to go to Nineveh in verse 2, and then verse 3 is supposed to sound like this. And Jonah arose. He gets in his car and he drives to Nineveh, right? I mean, he is on his way to do the very thing that God has called him to do. And it's a real shock. It's a surprise when you get to verse 2, and it's not that, or rather verse 3, when we read this. But Jonah rose to flee to Tarshish. God says go that way, and Jonah goes that way from the presence of the Lord. He went down to Joppa and found a ship going to Tarshish. He paid the fare and went on board to go with them to Tarshish, away from the presence of the Lord. Jonah runs. It's a surprise when you get to verse 3. It's not what you're expecting. Jonah runs. It's this storied presentation of sin. Jonah running is putting sin in story form. And as Jimmy did such a good job last week talking about this moment in Jonah's life, he worked through how defiance starts with doubt. And how doubt then leads to distance, away from the presence of the Lord. And then how distance leads to this descent in the life of Jonah. Over and over again in the text, you see Jonah going down. He goes down to Joppa. Twice he goes down into the ship. Chapter 2, verse 6, he goes down into the roots of the mountain, down to the land whose bars closed upon him forever. Now, one of the things I so appreciate about the story of Jonah and this text is that, when sin shows up in our life, it's always dressed to the nines. It always looks good. But part of what Jonah is helping us do is it talks about him going down, this descent down into the roots of the mountain, is it helps us look past the sort of good looks of sin all the way into the ugly heart of sin. And here is what sin's aim is for your life. It's to take you down into the roots of the mountains, where the bars close over you forever. And so Jonah is just this invitation for every runner, for every one of us in here that is running from God today, to turn from sin that is taking us down into the roots of the mountain, and to turn back to God. Every runner, the book of Jonah holds out that invitation to come back to God. Here's the amazing thing about our running. We can stop today and we can come back to God today. But that's a surprise. The second surprise is Jonah's response to God. Now, Jonah's response to God in a lot of ways sets the stage for the biggest surprise in the book. The greatest of all surprises in the book of Jonah is God's response to Jonah. We see in verse 3, Jonah's response to God, and then we get this sneak peek around the corner. It's this shocking view of God's response to Jonah. Now, we've laughed about this for the last couple of weeks, but again, I'm just going to say it again. If I were sort of in the story and inserted into the place of God into the story, the book of Jonah would be a really short book. Right? Verse 2, it's God says go. Verse 3, Jonah says no. And verse 4 would just be like a couple of words. God killed him. It's over. It's just 4 verses long, and the story has come to a conclusion. It'd be the shortest book in the Bible, right? And hear me, though. We often so presume upon the grace of God that we forget that God doesn't owe Jonah a second chance. God would have been right and just to end the story at verse 4. But that's not how the story ends. This is what makes verse 4 so shocking. Jonah runs from God, sin in story form. That's verse 3. Then verse 4, God runs after Jonah. That is grace in story form. Jonah runs from God, then God runs after Jonah. Chapter 1, verse 4. I love these 3 words. But the Lord. Where would we be in our lives apart from those 3 words? But the Lord. But the Lord. Those 3 words signal a turn in the story. Those 3 words signal a counteracting move on behalf of God. Those 3 words signal that grace is on the way, that God sees Jonah. He cares about Jonah. He's coming for Jonah. Grace is on the way. It's signaling those 3 words that God cares and is coming not just to a perishing city, the city of Nineveh, but to a running prodigal prophet. Grace is on the way. This verse taps into a rich biblical vein that we might call the pursuing grace of God. That's what we're seeing in verse 4. The pursuing grace of God. Now, what is grace? Grace is the unmerited favor or affection of God. It's unmerited. You cannot earn grace. You could never deserve grace. It's the unmerited favor or affection of God. Now, if you look throughout the scriptures, you're going to find a lot of characters in the Bible that tried to outrun the grace of God, the pursuing grace of God. David tried to outrun the pursuing grace of God. Moses tried to outrun the pursuing grace of God. Paul tried to outrun the pursuing grace of God. In this text, Jonah is trying to outrun the pursuing grace of God. But aren't we thankful that grace has never lost a race? It's never happened. Grace has never lost a race. Grace is still undefeated. Jonah flees to Joppa, verse 3. Verse 4, but the Lord. Jonah found a ship. He paid his fare. He got on the boat, but the Lord. Jonah is running as fast as he can to Tarshish, but the Lord. Jonah is on the run, but grace is about to win. The pursuing grace of God is around the corner. It's around the corner. And just like the grizzly bear dressed in sort of the blue shirt, right? Just like that, the grace of God came in a very unexpected form for Jonah. Grace came to Jonah in the form of a storm. Isn't that amazing? The grace of God came to Jonah's life. The pursuing grace of God came in the form of a storm. Verse 4, but the Lord. That's signaling God's coming. Grace is on the way. Now the question is, what is that grace going to look like? How's it going to come into Jonah's life? But the Lord hurled a great wind upon the sea, and there was a mighty tempest on the sea, so that the ship threatened to break up. Now think about what's happening here. the God of relentless, untiring, pursuing grace, harnesses the forces of nature to hunt down his running prophet. That's what God's doing. Grace comes in the form of a storm. Now, what kind of a storm is this? Listen to this description again of this storm. Verse 4. The Lord hurled a great wind upon the sea. That word great, gadol, is used 7 times in this text. It's saying something about this storm, right? It is a great wind. Verse 4, it was a mighty tempest. Verse 4, it's so bad that the ship was threatening to break up. Verse 5, it's so bad that mariners, right? These guys who've been on the sea all of their life are scared to death. They're crying out to their gods, right? They're throwing cargo to lighten the ship. They are scared to death. It's that sort of a storm. The grace of God in this text is less like a light shower and more like a great hurricane, a life-threatening hurricane. That's what the grace of God felt like in this text. Life-threatening. Now, I want to pause and consider this for a few moments. I want to just think with you through what this storm reveals about the pursuing grace of God. I want to think that through with you just for the next couple of minutes here. What does this storm reveal about the pursuing grace of God? Here's one thing it reveals. This storm reveals the size of God's grace. The size of God's grace. Let me tease this out with you. The word grace is a big biblical word, right? It is a huge, massive word in the Bible. And that word covers the multifaceted way that God deals with his people. That's what that word is signifying and saying. It's showing us how God deals with his sons and daughters, with his people. And far too many people, when they hear that word grace, it has shrunk down into a one-dimensional thing, into something much smaller than it actually is in the scriptures. When we use that word grace, it is oftentimes shrunk down in our understanding to cover just those things that are pleasurable that come from the hand of God. That's oftentimes how we see and think about grace. It's the things that are pleasurable that God gives us, the things that we want, the things that we are asking God for. It's when God gives us those things. So grace is, I got the job, right? Grace is, I got the promotion, I got the raise. Grace is, we're pregnant, right? This is grace. It's I went to the doctor and I got a clean bill of health. I am doing great. That is so often what grace, when we use that word, what we're saying it is. And yes to those things are grace from God. Yes and amen. But grace goes beyond just those things that are pleasurable in our lives. Think about Jonah for a moment. Put yourself in his shoes. Jonah did not want a storm. I think that's an easy thing to see and just observe when you read Jonah 1. Jonah, his worst nightmare in this moment is a storm, right? Jonah is on a Mediterranean cruise, and what Jonah wants, what would feel like grace from God to Jonah, is a 70-degree day with a slight wind blowing the ship straight to Tarshish, right? That's what would feel like grace to Jonah. But grace came in the form of a storm. And that storm shows us that grace is big enough to cover all things in our life, both pleasurable and painful. I want to say that one more time. This storm is showing us that grace is big enough to cover all things, everything in your life, both pleasurable and painful. So storms are not just, I got the job, but I got fired from the job. Grace is not just, I got married, I've always wanted to, but I'm still single. Grace is a difficult marriage. Grace can also take the form of cancer and sickness and persecution and loss and wayward children and not having a chance to have children. It can also take those forms. The storm of verse 4 shows us that God isn't just sovereign over our salvation. Jonah 2:10 shows that he is. But that he is also sovereign over our suffering. He's sovereign over both, in control of both, that both come from his hand. This storm introduces us to what we might call the uncomfortable grace of God. It's introducing us to a category of grace that we might call the uncomfortable grace of God. Now, what is the uncomfortable grace of God? Paul Tripp defines it this way. It's God taking you where you haven't chosen to go to produce in you what you couldn't achieve on your own. That's the uncomfortable grace of God. Jonah doesn't want to be in a storm. But God is taking Jonah where he doesn't want to go, where he hasn't chosen to go to produce in Jonah what Jonah couldn't achieve on his own. And God does this to all of his kids. He gives us uncomfortable grace. I remember listening to Randy Alcorn preach years ago, and he was talking about this idea of the uncomfortable grace of God. And he was talking about how God so often uses the storms of suffering in our life to produce in us things that we could never achieve on our own. And he said, if you could just imagine having two pieces of paper in front of you, and on one side you wrote the worst seasons of your life, the absolute worst of your life. And then on page 2, you wrote the best moments of your life with God. The seasons of deepest intimacy, of your deepest spiritual vibrancy. And then he said, if you overlay those two on top of one another, it's amazing to see how often those two things match. If you've lived life for any amount of time, you can probably look back over your life and see that, to see how that's true. It sure was for Job. It is hard to imagine a man having a worse day than Job, isn't it? All of his children die. He loses all of his money, right? He loses everything. He loses his health. I mean, he loses everything in his life. It's hard to imagine a worse day. He's receiving the uncomfortable grace of God. And Job thinks of it this way. In Job 121, he says, it's the Lord who has given and the Lord who has taken away. He's recognizing that my suffering is from the hand of God, that God is sovereign over all of these things. But whatever sort of secondary causes we might want to attribute to our suffering, that the storm of that suffering, Job is saying, is from God. And this worst season in Job's life led to some of the best seasons of his life with God. If you remember how the story of Job ends, he is looking up to God in Job 42, verse 5, and he said, I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eyes see you. In the worst moment of his life, God is inviting him deeper into his heart. And it's there that Job's view of God changes from a hearing with the ear to a seeing God. The worst season of his life led to the best season of his life with God. God will take you where you haven't chosen to go to produce in you what you couldn't achieve on your own. Just think back in your own life about how true that's been. And do you know what the Lord calls those seasons of suffering, those storms of suffering in our life? Grace. Grace. This is the language Paul uses in Philippians 1:29 when he says, it has been granted to you on behalf of Christ to suffer with him. It's been granted to you. That word has got the root word of grace in there. It has been graciously given to you by God, these storms of suffering. It's a grace that doesn't go down easily in the moment, but it is grace from God nonetheless. When Paul Tripp goes on to talk about this, he says, in those moments when we find ourselves in the storms of life, seasons of suffering, dark seasons of suffering, and we find ourselves crying out to God, where is grace? Where is grace? He says this, he says, God is saying back to you, you're getting it. You're getting grace. It's not the grace of relief. It's not the grace of release, it's the grace of refinement. And all of us need the grace of refinement in our life, don't we? We all need that grace in our life. A couple of weeks ago, I came home and Eva, our youngest daughter, was just beside herself. It was a really rough moment. We walk in the door and it was wild. And come to find out, she had a splinter that was on her ring finger, and it was down behind the nail. So that's a pretty sensitive spot. So it was not a pretty moment here. So she's got a splinter stuck right there, and she is letting the world know she has a splinter stuck right there. And so I see it, and thankfully the splinter is sticking up over the nail. So I'm like, great. In theory, at least, this is going to be a really easy sort of splinter removal moment. Well, I was wrong. I get the tweezers. I come back into our living room. And when I came back into the living room, and when I made the move toward her hand, my sweet, precious little 10-year-old girl shapeshifted on me. She became a wounded Wolverine right there on the couch in our living room. And when I went for the splinter, that Wolverine went wild. I mean, there is a fight happening in our living room 2 weeks ago. And in the middle of that fight, she says the meanest thing she could think of. She looks at me and says, "You're the meanest dad of all the dads." I mean, she is just, anything she can do to make this moment stop, she is doing it. And not knowing that I got the splinter out in that moment, she jerks her hand away and says, "Don't touch that splinter. Don't do it. You stay away from it." And I hold up the tweezers and I'm like, "Are you talking about this splinter? This one, right?" When I think about that moment, it just feels so normal in our life with God. That God often introduces grace, uncomfortable grace in our life to do the necessary work of removing the splinters of remaining sin. It goes down sideways. We hate it. We thrash at God. We say every mean thing we can think of about God, right? But this is a grace from God removing those splinters of remaining sin. When I think about one of the jobs of being a pastor, of one of your pastors, one of a pastor's job is to prepare you for seasons of suffering, for storms of grace. They're inevitable. If you're not in one now, it's just a matter of time before you are, right? And the best way I know to ready you for those painful, sort of take your breath away days that's coming for us all is to continually point us to the size of God's grace. That the grace of God does not just cover the pleasurable moments of our life, but also the painful moments of our life. To help us all see, myself included, that the grace of God can be uncomfortable. It can come into our life in the form of a storm. And for those who today you find yourself in that storm, this storm is not evidence of God's lack of attention to you, that he's neglecting you, that he doesn't love you. It's not that. It's actually evidence that God sees you and is at work in you and is coming for you with his pursuing grace. That's what seasons of suffering are evidence of. The storm reveals the size of God's grace. But here's the second thing the storm reveals. Not just the size of God's grace, but the severity of God's grace. The severity of God's grace. Now, look again at verse 4, and just again, notice the words that are used to describe this storm. They're not gentle words, right? They're severe words. The Lord hurled a great wind. 7 times, a great wind upon the sea. It's called a mighty tempest. It's so bad that the ship is threatening to break up. It's so bad that these sailors are, doing the offloading the cargo sort of moment. It's that bad. It's that severe. The grace of God came to Jonah in a way that was that strong, that was that tough. It was tough enough to terrify hardened sailors. Now, you might circle that word hurled. That's the same word used to describe Saul hurling a spear at David. Same word. And the author of Jonah here is showing us that with just absolute pinpoint accuracy, God has whipped up the wind and he's thrown the wind like a spear right toward his wayward prophet. Now, why would God do that? Why is that? Well, think about our man Jonah for a moment. He is on the run and Jonah thinks he is running toward freedom, not knowing that he is running towards slavery. Jonah, he thinks he is running to life, not knowing that he's actually running to death. Jonah, he thinks that he is running to the land of hope, where all of his dreams are going to come true, not knowing that he is running straight into despair. Jonah is buying all the lies that sin sells. Every one of them. He's buying every one of those over-promising, under-delivering lies. He's bought them all. Now, ask yourself this question. As you watch Jonah's defiance here, there are two ways to view what this storm is from God. Two ways to view it. And you can just ask yourself which way you view it. Two ways to view it. Way number one is this storm is a picture of the wrath of God coming to punish Jonah. That's one way to view the storm. Here is the second way to view the storm. This storm is a picture of the pursuing grace of God coming to rescue Jonah. Now, how do you view it? This story could not be more clear that this storm is the pursuing grace of God. Now, think about the good news that the gospel announces. The gospel announces that on the cross, Jesus endured every last part of the punishment of God for our sin. There is no wrath left in the heart of God for his sons and daughters. So now, on this side of faith in Jesus, we get nothing but the pursuing grace of God, even when it's severe. There's no wrath left for the sons and daughters of God. There is only pursuing grace. So this storm is not a picture of God's wrath against sin. This storm is a picture of God's pursuing grace that comes after his people in the midst of their sin. That's what this storm is. It's a picture of pursuing grace. I love how one commentator talks about it. He says, the storm is evidence that God spares no expense in the pursuit of his children. This storm introduces us, yes, to the category of uncomfortable grace, and also to the category of what we might refer to as the intervening grace of God. The intervening grace of God. Do you know that grace of God in your life? The intervening grace of God. The grace of God that saves us from us. That's what this storm is. God is intervening. He's interfering with Jonah's plans. God has come in his pursuing grace to save Jonah from Jonah. That's what God is doing in this storm. Jonah 1, in particular verse 4, is a storied presentation of Hebrews chapter 12, verse 6. When the author of Hebrews says, "For the Lord disciplines," he corrects, he comes with severe grace, right? The Lord disciplines the one he loves. So when we're on the run from God, we're resisting, we're rebelling against God. In an act of unbelievable mercy, God comes with his intervening grace. God comes to save us from us, to rescue us from us. I don't know about you, but when I look back over my life, only God knows the atrocities I would have committed apart from his intervening grace. There is no telling how dark and how deep sin would have been in my life apart from intervening grace in my life. And this is what God is doing for Jonah. Intervening grace. God sends a storm into Jonah's life, not to punish Jonah, but in pursuit of Jonah. Now, let me clarify something here. This is tough love from God, right? It is a hard love. It has a hard edge on it. But God's tough love comes from his kind heart. And it's important to see that. Anytime we're receiving tough love from God, it's important to know that behind that tough love is the kind heart of God. But behind God's hard hand is a soft heart, a tender heart, a kind heart. Listen to Hebrews 12:6 again. The Lord disciplines, there's tough love. Let me stress the second half of that. The one he loves. He disciplines the son and daughter that he loves. that he cares for. One pastor illustrated it this way. He said, picture a patient with a deadly disease, and he goes to the doctor, and the doctor tells him, you're dying. This disease is going to kill you. Your days are numbered. But he looks at the patient and says, but here's the great news. He pulls out a pill, and he says, this pill will cure you. This pill will literally save your life. So just take this pill, and you will be cured. And the patient looks back at the doctor and says, you're crazy. There's no way I'm taking that pill. That pill is not a cure. That pill is poison. I'm out. And the patient runs out of the room. Now, imagine for a moment, you're the doctor and that patient is your son. Imagine that moment. What would you do if you're the doctor and that patient is your son? I think here's the right answer in that moment. As a dad, you would do whatever it takes. Whatever it takes. Whatever it takes to get that pill down the mouth and into the stomach and into the system of your son, that's what you would do. In that moment, we are perfectly fine. Every good dad is perfectly fine with what we might call tender violence. Right? We're good with that. It's coming from a tender heart, but it can sure have a heavy hand to it, can it? It's tender violence. And like every kind-hearted dad, God would rather woo us with his tender love than wound us with his tough love. But when we persist in our rebellion, God loves us too much to let us ruin our life. He loves us too much to let us do that. So he'll come to us with his tough love, with tender violence to do whatever it takes to rescue us from us. And don't we need that grace from God periodically? If you just look back in your life, can't you see evidence that throughout your life you have needed that pursuing, intervening love of God? So in this way, this storm carries a word to all runners. And here's God's word to all runners, that God loves you too much to let you run forever. The pursuing grace of God is coming for you. And if you're really a child of God, if you're one of his, part of the question that Jonah 1 just presents to you is, how much of the tender violence of God are you wanting to endure? How much of that do you want to walk through? But before you lay down your arms, before you stop running and you come back to God. The storm shows this, the severity of God's grace. His tender violence, his intervening grace, that God loves his kids too much to let them run forever. And lastly, this storm points us to Jesus, the ultimate expression of the grace of God. It points us to Jesus, the supreme example of the size and severity of God's grace is not found in the story of Jonah, but in the story of Jesus. I love what one commentator said. He said, it's God's affection for Jonah that sent the intervening storm. It's God's affection for us that sent an intervening Savior. Yes and amen to that. It's God's affection for us that sent Jesus. The scriptures clearly sort of acclimate us and show us that we are all natural born runners, that we're not just seeing Jonah in this story, but we're seeing Jonah in us. We are all natural born runners. We are spring loaded. We come out of the womb spring loaded and ready to rebel against God. This is why Romans 5 calls us enemies of God, not just a few of us, but all of us. Now put yourself back in that doctor's office and God is the doctor, you are the patient. What would God do to rescue his sin-sick people? Answer, whatever it takes. And whatever it takes took Jesus to a Roman cross, and there he endured the storm of God's wrath on our behalf. Just picture there for a moment in your mind's eye, Jesus hanging there upon a cross. Just get in your mind's eye the dying love of Jesus. That's God saying, I don't run from runners, I run to them. Just see in your mind's eye there Jesus, nailed to a tree. That is God saying that regardless of how fast you're running, my pursuing grace will not lose this race. It will not lose. I'm going to catch you. I'm going to catch you. Just see Jesus, the dying love of Jesus. That is God saying, this is how far my grace goes in pursuit of prodigals. This is how far. Will you bow with me? I want to give you just a moment to allow the Spirit of God to press into you what would be helpful today, to wipe away the things that wouldn't be. We came into this room from 1,000 different places today. For some of us, our first sort of step to God is that first step toward Him, where we turn from our sin and we throw our life upon the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. And God is working in you today. He's talking to you today. He's readied your heart for that. He has sovereignly, providentially brought you into this room to hear this particular text preached as an act of intervening grace in your life, to pull you across the line of faith, to rescue you, to save you. And your response today is to hold up your life before God and to say, God, here I am. I am trusting in the person and work of Jesus. Rescue me. And God would love to do that today. He stands with arms wide open, ready to rescue you. So there where you are, in the best way you know how, call out to God right now. And for others of us in the room, we have come into relationship with God, but we're running. We are running. And Jonah has a word to runners. It's an invitation to stop our run, to lay down our arms, and to come back home. I just wonder how many of us need that today. Just to come back home to God. This is what the Bible calls repentance. It's turning from our sin and coming back to Jesus. It's confessing our sin and just depending again today for the person and work to Jesus to cover all of our sin. So God, would you be at work in this room right now? God, would you be doing that work of bringing every runner home? Oh God, would you do it? God, where we even now find ourselves resisting, even now find ourselves refusing, God, would you melt that resistance? God, would you thaw our hearts? God, as we look upon the dying love of Jesus, would you just melt us today? And God, would you bring us home? And it's in your good name that we ask it. Amen.